सत्यमेव जयते नानुद्रिम् उत्तिष्ठतो जागृत प्राप्य वरान्नि भून्मृताम्. Hello, welcome to In the Morning. It is 5:30 a.m. and we are live to reach to you, preach to you, and greet to you with the new principles of the ancient, the real Sanatana Dharma, how the people were living in the ancient era. So, in this episode number 6, we welcome you on the board of this podcast episode. Today we will be teach you the sacrifices, what is exactly sacrifice is and how it exists in the world of Sanatana Dharma. So this is the point of discussion today. Let me start with you the verses 5 of the ancient 116-year-old manuscript, the real Sanatana Dharma. This Dharma tells us how we should react, behave, and how we should live on the universe, on the motherland earth. The sacrifices. The idea of offering sacrifices is very familiar in India, but a pupil need to understand the principle which underlines all the sacrifices so that he may realize that everyone should sacrifice himself to the good of others and that all sacrifice of other things are meant to teach a man how he ought at last to sacrifice himself. The first thing to grasp is that creation is sacrifice. Ishvara confines himself, limits himself in matter in order that a universe may be made manifest. Shruti and Samriti alike proclaim that truth, as in the Purusha Shukta of the Rigveda or as in the allusion by Shri Krishna to the formal sacrifice that caused the birth of beings. Immersion in matter is in spiritual language called death, and Ishvara thus sacrificed himself in order that he might bring into separate being portions of himself, the Jiva, who might develop all his power in matter in all infinite variety of forms. This is the primary sacrifice. And on this is based the law. This also gives us the meaning of sacrifice. It is the powering of life for the benefit of others. The sacrifice, the idea of offering sacrifices is very familiar in the India, but a pupil needs to understand the principle which underline all the sacrifices so that he may realize that everyone should sacrifice himself to the good of others and that all sacrifice of other things are meant to teach a man how he ought at last to sacrifice himself. The first thing to grasp is that creation is a sacrifice. Ishvara confines himself, limits himself in matter in order that a universe may be made manifest. Shruti and Samriti alike proclaim this truth as in the Purusha Shukta of the Rigveda or as in the allusion of Shri Krishna to the formal sacrifice that caused the birth of beings. Immersion in matter is in spiritual language called death. And Ishvara thus sacrificed himself in order that he might bring into separate beings portion of himself. The Jiva, who might dwell all his power in matters in an infinite variety of forms, this is the primary sacrifice. And on this is based the law. This also gives us the meaning of sacrifice. It is the powering of life for the benefit of others. The law of sacrifice is the law of life for all jivas. In the earlier stages of their growth, they are forcibly sacrificed and so progressive, involuntary, without their own consent or even knowledge. Their forms being violently wrenched by from them, and they propelled into a new ones as a little more developed. Thus, the jivas of the mineral kingdom are prepared to pass on into the vegetable by the breaking up of their mineral bodies from the spore of plants. The jivas of the vegetable kingdom are prepared to pass on into the animals by the breaking up of their vegetable bodies for the sport of animal life. The jivas of animal kingdoms are prepared to pass on this into the human by the breaking up of their bodies from the sport of other animals, of savage or and of certain types of men. And even the jivas of the human kingdom are prepared to rise into higher race by breaking up of their human bodies for the sport of other human lives in cannibalism, war, etc. In all these cases, the bodies are sacrifices fired for the benefit of others without the assent of the embodied consciousness. Only after untold ages does the Jiva recognize in the body the university of the law and begin to sacrifice his own Upanishad deliberately for the good of those around. For the good of those around him, this is called self sacrifice and is the showing forth of the divinity of the Jiva, the proof that he is of the nature of Ishvara. A wonderful story of uttermost self sacrifice is told in the Mahabharata. Indira, the king of Devas, was sore bested by the Asura Vritara, born of the wrath of a rishi whom Indira had offended by an unrighteous act. Viritra, heading the Daityas, defeated Indra and his armies in battle, drove him away from his capital, Amravati, and took away his sovereignty. Long the Devas wandered with their king in exile, and repeatedly they made endeavors to regain their capital, but were vanquished again and again. Finally, they learned that the righteousness worth of a rishi could not be allayed except by the voluntary self-sacrifices and pity of another rishi, and that Viratra could be slain by no other weapon than the thunderbolt made with the self-given bones of a holy one. And they went eagerly to the Rishi Dadenchi and told their woeful to him. What they told the woeful tale to him what is happening in the capital of the Devas. And he was filled with a great pity and said, I give to you my body willingly to make what you of it you like. And when their artificer Vishwakarma shrank from laying a rude and painful hand upon that shining body of beauty and tapas. The Dhinchi smiled and said, "Cover this body up with salt. Bring here a herd of cows. They shall lick off the salt and flesh together, and ye shall take the bones which only you require. And so notch of this body shall be wasted." Notch means a small part of any single part of this body shall not be wasted, and this was done with Viratra fell before the might ball of that wondrous sacrifices or sacrifice. The jiva is led up into this point by the teaching of the rishis who bid him make sacrifices of his possessions for a good that he does not receive immediately. They show him that when a man sacrifices to others, his gifts return to him increase in the future. A man is to sacrifice some of his goods, which may be looked on as outlying pieces of himself, and he is promised that his act of self denial shall bring him increased possessions. Next, he was taught to make similar sacrifices and to deny himself, any himself present enjoyment in order that he might lay up for himself increased happiness on the other side of death in Swarga. Thus, the practice of sacrificing was made habitual, and man, by sacrificing his position in the hope of reward, prepared to learn that it was his duty to sacrifice himself in the service of others, and to find in the joy of that service his reward. Another lesson taught in these sacrifices was the relation man bear to all the beings around him. That is not a solitary, isolated life, but that all lives are interdependent and can only propel permanently as they recognize this interdependence. The rishis taught him to sacrifice daily to the devas, to rishi, to ancestor, to men, animals, and showed him that as all these made sacrifices to enrich his life, he had incurred to them a debt, a duty which he must pay by sacrifice. As he lives on others, he must, in common honesty, live for others. Sacrifice is right, a thing that ought to be done, that is old. Finally, as the Jiva recognizes his parentage, his identity in nature, which Ishvara sacrifice becomes happiness, a delight, and the pouring out of life for others is felt as a joyous exercise of innate divine powers. Instead of seeing how much he can take and how little he can give, he tries to see how little he can take and how much he can give. He begins to look very carefully into what he takes for the sport of his own upadhis and seeks to reduce to the lowest point of the suffering inflicted by the breaking up of lower forms for his support. He abandoned the foods and the amusements which inflict pain on sentient beings and tries to become the friend of all creatures. He realizes that while the preying of animals on animals, of men on men, and the slaughter of animals by men for food or sport are necessary at certain stages of evolution for the development of needed faculties and powers. Men should gradually evolve from these and cultivate the faculties of gentleness, sympathy, and tenderness. regarding the weaker as younger slaves to be helped instead of as victims to be immolated. As a man lives in such thoughts of his separatedness from younger slaves, he begins to feel more really his non-separateness from elder slaves and from the universal parent Ishvara. Slowly, he realizes that his true function is to live for others as Ishvara lives for all, and that his true happiness lies in becoming a channel in which the life of Ishvara is followed, a willing instrument to do the will of Ishvara. They every then every action becomes a sacrifice to Ishvara and action no longer bind him. Thus the law of sacrifice become also the law of liberation. सह यज्ञै प्रजास् पृष्ठता पूर्वाचा प्रजापति अनेन प्रस्विष्यै धनव एषो तस्विशिष्टकां मधुक देवानां भावतयानेन ते देवा भयावन्तु परस्परं भावयन्ति श्रेय परमावासयथ इष्टानां भोगान् हि वो देवा दायस्ते यज्ञभाविते तदैतनान् प्रदायेवेव यो वह्निसकेतनन् एव स यज्ञशिष्टानि सन्तो मुच्यते सर्वकिल्पे वशे भुज्यते ते ध्वजो पापा ये पश्चातापि कारकारात् त्रादादान् भवति भूतानि प्रज्ञा संभव यज्ञात् भवति प्रज्ञनो यज्ञाकरं समन्दरौ करं ब्राह्मणो ब्रह्मदे विद्धि ब्रह्माक्षार सुरसमुन्दरम् तस्मात् स्वर्गगत ब्रह्मनित्यां यज्ञ प्रतिष्ठितम्. Having in ancient time emanated mankind together with sacrifice, Prajapati declared, by this shall ye propagate he be this to you the Kamaduk. With this nourish ye the devas, and may the devas nourish you. Thus nourishing one another, ye shall reap the supremest good. For nourished by sacrifice, the devas shall bestow on you the enjoyment you desire, as thief rarely is who enjoyeth that is given by them without returning them out. The righteous who eat the remains of the sacrifices are free from all sins, but the impetious who dress food for their own sake, they rarely eat sin. From food, creatures come from food. From rain is the production of food. Rain proceeds from sacrifices. Sacrifices are raised out of action. Nodo forms the Brahma, the Veda. Action growths and Brahma, the Veda, from the imperishable comes. Therefore, Brahman, the all permitting, is ever present in sacrifice. कांडदंत कर्मग्रहणे सिद्धि यजंत इहि देवता क्षिप्र हि मानुषे लोके सिद्धि भवति कर्मजा. They who long after success in action on earth sacrifice to the devas, for in brief space, verily in this world of men, success is born of action. आवा राजा नावधरे वृवित्तया हवैभिरिन्द्रवरुण नमोभिः अस्मै इन्द्रवरुण विश्वरयते वसन्तो पुरुषं यमिंद्रत वरुण समष्टते की प्रावता के नत्ते तुजु जाना. O kings, Indira, Varuna, to this our sacrifice be ye turned by offering and homage. O Indra, Varuna, plenteous wealth and food and blessing give us. This my song may it reach Indira, Varuna, and by its force being sons and offsprings. अदैत यश्चरते भ्राज मनुषे यथा काल चाहुतेः हृदयदायन तन्मयि यतन्ते तु सूर्यस्य रश्मयो यत्र देवा न परिरेके विश्वास हितो हितो तमाहुवते सुरवर्चसं सूर्यरश्मिभिर्यजमानं वहन्त्य प्रियवाज्रभवन्ति तस्मो य जन्मसि एषो वरुणो तुष्टो ब्रह्मलोके. Whoever works sacrifices pouring liberation into the shining of these, the seventh flame previously mentioned, at the proper time his these sun rays lead where dwells the one Lord of the Devas, saying to him, "Come, come, come, these pleasant liberation carry the sacrifices by the sun rays, worshipping him and saying the sweet words. This is your pure, well deserved Brahma, the world. यज्ञशिष्टा मृत्युभुजे यान्ति ब्रह्म सनातनं नाय लोको समस्तस्य यज्ञस्य कुतुसनैव कुरु ततम्. The eaters of the life-giving remains of sacrifice go to the eternal Brahman. This world is not for the non-sacrificer, much less the other. O best of the Gurus. गतसङ्गतये मुक्तस्य ज्ञानावस्थनि चेतसो यज्ञचारतो करं समग्रो prevailयते. From one with attachment, dead, harmonious with his thoughts, established in wisdom, his work sacrifices all karma melt away. Yakt karopi yadishanasi yajuhoshi dadati yata yatapa yasasi kayate tatkurushasu marta paragam shubha shubha falaish chichariva mordai karma bandhane. Whatsoever thou doest, whatsoever thou eatest, whatsoever thou offerest, whatsoever thou givest, whatsoever thou doest of ancestrally, O Kautya, do thou that as offering into me. Thus shalt thou be liberated from the bonds of action, yielding good and evil fruits.